So, thank you very much. If I may start, yes, in English.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
So, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at the conference, and forgive me for my lack of knowledge of French. So, unfortunately, I have to speak English here. Nevertheless, I would like just to make some short remarks about the topics you have thoroughly discussed during the conference, concerning first and foremost the lack of methodology to trace the real factors which are shaping Polish Eastern policy or Polish foreign policy as such, beginning with one very short remark about the lack of discussion of geopolitical choice of my country since the very beginning, since the 90s. Take the year 1999 and the debate, or to be more precise, the lack of debate before our accession to NATO. In several other countries, you had referendums, you had public debates or debates of experts before making such a strategic decision. In Poland, just to remind the facts, in 1999, we had practically no public debate in the mainstream media, at least, when it comes to the reasonability of joining NATO at that time. And in Polish parliament, which has 460 MPs, we had just certain dogmatism of Polish foreign policy, and the lack of discussions when it comes to strategic choices. The same goes for the lack of discussion when it comes to the Eastern enlargement of NATO and, Eastern enlargement of European Union as well. If you look at the content of mainstream media or at the position of mainstream politicians, I mean those represented in the parliament, with a few exceptions, of course, you can notice undoubtedly that there is no one who asks the question about the geopolitical consequences of Eastern NATO or EU enlargement, of even after the war has broke in Ukraine in 2022, we hadn't that discussion. We hadn't that discussion actually about the reasons of the war as such, about the dimension of Eastern expansion of NATO or European Union, about the consequences of the lack of debate about possible risks, yes, concerning Ukraine, not only Ukraine actually. If you talk about the Eastern dimension of Polish foreign policy, you have to remind also our policy towards Belarus, another of our neighbors in the East, then our Eastern policy towards Caucasus countries like first and foremost Georgia at a certain time, and let's say certain sympathies of former Polish President Lech Kaczyński, particularly in 2008 during the war in Georgia, the Russia-Georgia war. And if you look at this lack of debate, you can also imagine that there is lack of scholar debate about all those issues. Basically, there's no scholar literature, or almost no scholar literature, analyzing the roots of Polish Eastern policy. We might mention just a few authors like Andrzej Turkowski, who had made some research on the motives and main factors shaping Polish foreign policy, particularly in its Eastern dimension. If we would try to pose some questions, because what I'm going to do now is just to pose some questions and make short remarks because of the lack of existing knowledge and the lack of sources as well when it comes to main factors shaping Polish Eastern policy. We would have to divide the factors of influence to, let's say, four basic groups. The first one are external factors, which means that, well, Poland, as every Central European country, I guess, after 1989, has some structures of dependence from different centers of power. Of course, basically Western centers of power, mainly the United States in case of Poland. We have no direct sources or direct knowledge as scholars to analyze those structures of dependence. Well, I personally have some experience as a former member of parliament, but those are just impressions I could have, and no real sources about these structures of dependence are available. So for a scholar trying to find out the real factors shaping Polish foreign policy, it is still quite hard to find those dependencies, those influences, which are, of course, as we might suppose, well, not open or public influences, but rather influences shaping our policy and our political class since several years. By the way, Professor Bruno Dworensky has analyzed the historical elements of all those dependencies in his magnificent book about solidarity movement, and several connections between solidarity movement and various Western institutions trying to influence solidarity as such, also by creating dependencies, financial or personal dependencies. So this is a thing which has to be thoroughly studied in the future, perhaps, because well, the lack of the sources comes out from the fact that we don't have the data about the activities of several intelligence structures and so on, who got their influence over the solidarity activists at that time, and in the future and in contemporary Poland, their influence over people who are shaping and who are responsible for our Eastern policy and for our foreign policy as such. So this is an external factor, I'd say. To say the least, we might give just one example of one of the very well-known examples of Polish Eastern policy. We might talk about the so-called Eastern Partnership Program, which was drafted, I just wanted to remind that, by then Minister and now Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Radosław Sikorski, together with his Swedish counterpart, Carl Bildt. But from the very beginning, the idea of Eastern Partnership, promoted by Poland, Sweden, and some other countries in our region, was an idea, well, highly supported by United States and by the administration of United States, and quite controversial in other European Union countries. To say the least, if we look about the opinions voiced by experts, but also politicians in Germany and France, when it comes to the idea of Eastern Partnership, well, they were quite skeptical. They were quite skeptical, or at least there were some debates about the reasonability of drafting such a project as Eastern Partnership Program, which actually from the very beginning might have been treated as a project directed against Russia or excluding Russia from the Eastern dimension of EU policy. So this is one of the examples, and of course we know the, let's say, deep personal ties, including very personal ties of Mr. Sikorski with at least some parts of US establishment, at least let's say the democratic part of the establishment. Then we knew about the influences of Zbigniew Brzeziński. I have heard that Zbigniew Brzeziński has been mentioned several times by the former speakers at this conference. So, of course, Zbigniew Brzeziński and his impact on Polish politics, his impact, regardless the fact that he was an American expert, an American advisor of American presidents, nevertheless, he had a huge influence over the way of thinking in Poland as well. So these are just two basic examples of those external structures of dependence or of influence, if you like, over Polish foreign policy. There are also internal factors as well, of course, and well, since the very beginning, since the beginning of the 90s, we might say, we can talk about a deeply rooted Russian factor in all debates about Polish security, defense, and Polish foreign policy. So Russia became the main actor even in the times of Yeltsin. Of course, it was more and more exaggerated, more and more important after 2000, after Putin came to power. But nevertheless, from the very beginning, Russia was perceived as a main threat to our not only security, but one might say that even for our independence. So this is an internal factor of Russia as a main factor, main actor, main subject of all political discussions in our country. The internal factor, being Russia, is strictly connected to the historical factor. I would call that historical factor. Of course, this is first and foremost the influence of some ideas, of some doctrines, of some political doctrines, which were quite influential in Poland's history. First one could be called Jagiellonian doctrine, which means the doctrine of the second of the Polish dynasties, who created the common state of Lithuania and Poland, but nevertheless, Lithuania was actually a territory which was Russian-speaking and Orthodox, of course. This was not Lithuania in the contemporary meaning of the country and of the ethnicity of Lithuanian. So the idea that Poland is an important player in Eastern Europe, in Orthodox and let's say Eastern Slavic part of Europe, comes from those times, and we still talk, as some scholars do in Poland, about the phantom pains of our history, of this Jagiellonian period of Polish history. Phantom pains mean that in contemporary Polish politics, you have a certain feeling of let's say, importance of post-Soviet countries. Yes, I mean, post-Soviet countries are perceived, at least by some of our political, some parts of our political lights, as the part of our responsibility, area of our geopolitical, political responsibility. Yes, so it's more or less a stereotype that we are an important player there, that we have to civilize. There's also such a stereotype in Polish politics, and to bring democracy to become a model country for all other countries on the post-Soviet area. This is deeply historically rooted, of course, but, well, the idea and the doctrine of neo-Prometheism has been already mentioned today, and I would just like to show that the main designers, let's say, of Polish Eastern policy, even nowadays, like Paweł Kowal, particularly when it comes to our relations with Ukraine, are very deeply inspired by the idea of Prometheism. Prometheism was drafted and created by the military intelligence of pre-war Poland in 20s to confront Soviet Union at that time, of course, but it has been reworked, it has been rewritten in contemporary Poland, and it is still a source of inspiration for several Polish decision makers. To be honest, the Polish knowledge, or I would even say lack of knowledge of the post-Soviet area, was very clearly and perfectly depicted by the case of Wojciech Kononczuk, the head of state-run Center for Eastern Studies. This is a think tank which is coordinated by Polish Prime Minister. Just a few weeks ago, Kononczuk told that we still use for our expertise the methodology of pre-war Polish Sovietology to analyze contemporary Russia. So what he told actually is that even Polish think tanks working for the Polish government, for the Polish authorities, are still deeply rooted in stereotypes from the pre-war Poland. Yeah? That actually, by the way, tells us very much about the lack of expertise in Poland when it comes to Russia and when it comes to all post-Soviet area. In my personal view, in my personal opinion, I don't know if you would agree with me, but anyway, one of the very few Polish authors who had some authority when it comes to research of Russia, or at least of Russian philosophy, Russian ideology, Russian ideas, as such was Professor Andrzej Walicki, who definitely was one of the very few authors translated into several languages and very well known in scholar circles all around the world. If you look at contemporary Polish authors, with very few exceptions, you practically won't meet anyone who is quoted, who is a kind of source, authoritative source about Russia and post-Soviet area. So we are not experts, actually. Although we tend to, at least our political class, ruling class, tends to present Poland as an expert for the rest of Europe, for all other European countries, claiming that, well, we know the Russians very well because of our history and so on. But from objective scholar point of view, it's not true, actually. So this is another factor. I have also heard about some of the speakers at the conference mentioning Jerzy Giedroyć, quite close to Paris, because as we all know, he published his Cultura magazine in Paris, Maison Lafitte. Nevertheless, if you look at the late works of Jerzy Giedroyć and his idea of creating our relations with contemporary Russian Federation after the fall of Soviet Union, you would find out that actually most of the Polish experts and politicians haven't read that or haven't taken that into account. I mean, the late thoughts of Jerzy Giedroyć, who was calling for more or less rational policy towards pragmatic policy towards Russian Federation, and who acknowledged actually the deep difference between Soviet Union, the geopolitics of Soviet Union, and the geopolitics of Russian Federation, as well as all political and geopolitical goals of those totally different countries when it comes to their identity, when it comes to their way to perceive the outside world. So this is a kind of deformed implementation of the ideas of Giedroyć, if we would assess the current Polish policy. And then the last of the four factors I would like to indicate here when it comes to Polish Eastern policy is, of course, the socio-psychological factor. This is also something very deeply interconnected with our history, of course, with our way to perceive our Eastern neighbors as such. We have to stress here that the most disseminated Polish stereotype is a stereotype that everything east of our borders, every country placed in the former Soviet Union is depicted as Russian in terms of culture, in terms of mentality. Well, actually now I've also mentioned, I heard that one of the speakers mentioned the book of Zbigniew Parafianowicz, which is actually very up to date. Zbigniew Parafianowicz analyzing the views of contemporary Polish political class and decision makers clearly shows that most of them tend to perceive contemporary Ukraine, let's say, through the lens of Sovietism or Homo Sovieticus as such, or Russia and Russian culture, Ruski Mir, if you would use the Russian word. So on the one hand, this is a contradiction, of course, an internal contradiction of Polish expertise and of Polish way to perceive, to look at post-Soviet area, because on the one hand, a lot of Polish experts and authors tend to support the idea of, let's say, independent states, totally different than Russia, totally opposed to Russia and so on. But on the other hand, a lot of people still perceive the post-Soviet area as such, or post-imperial former area of Russian Empire as deeply rooted, well, not in the so-called Latin culture or Western culture as some of our thinkers claimed, but deeply rooted in tyrannic or Soviet or post-Soviet or then Ruski Mir cultural civilization. So this is another problem which could be perceived in terms of stereotypes of some, let's say, emotions and so on. And my last remark, this is a task for scientists, for scholars. I think we are not able now, the moment being, because of the lack of the sources I have already mentioned, to realize that task, but nevertheless, it would be very interesting, in my opinion, to analyze Polish foreign policy from the point of view of different paradigms. First and foremost, the classical realism. I mean, Hans Morgenthau, for instance. Actually, Morgenthau claimed that there are and there still exist some irrational elements of foreign policy decision making. I would totally agree with him, because these non-rational factors which spring from emotions, from stereotypes, are, in my opinion, one of the most important factors when it comes to our Eastern policy of Poland as such. On the other hand, you have, of course, the excellent work of contemporary representatives of realism, of offensive realism. I mean, of course, Professor John Mearsheimer and Sebastian Rosato and their latest book. Well, they claim that there are practically no irrational factors shaping foreign policy. In my personal opinion, in my personal view, we should balance, we should analyze the Polish foreign policy and its Eastern dimension from those 2 points of view, of those 2 paradigms. On the one hand, if you look at classical realist paradigm, you should notice the existence of irrational factors. On the other hand, if you look at Rosato, Mearsheimer, and the others, who claim that irrationalism in foreign policy is not so important, you might come to a conclusion that Poland doesn't have its own independent foreign policy, but of course, it has the policy of certain great powers and great players, and it's just an instrument. Therefore, the emotions, the stereotypes would be used or abused in some cases by external powers to shape and to influence Polish foreign policy. Nevertheless, due to certain restrictions, as I have already mentioned, restrictions when it comes to the sources or the lack of the sources to analyze the real roots of the policy as such, it is a very difficult task, and I guess that we'll have to wait perhaps several decades to find out the true roots, the important documents about the, let's say, secrets of decision-making when it comes to Polish Eastern policy. At the moment being, we can, of course, analyze the ideological factor, neo-Prometheism and its different variations. We can analyze open statements, public statements made by several Polish politicians or scholars, but, well, nothing more. And I still think that to have the full picture of Polish foreign policy and the factors shaping it, you would have to analyze also the sources which are not available at the moment. So that's my appeal, that we should actually think about Polish foreign policy and its Eastern dimension from different perspectives, complementary perspectives, interconnected factors, and that the whole thing is more complicated, more complex than, let's say, those claims that it's fully, totally shaped by ideology, for instance. Yes, there are also some other factors than ideology, also some other factors than political doctrines in Poland. Well, thank you very much for having me here, for giving me an opportunity to participate in the conference.